Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Right to Read initiative. My name is Dr. Kathryn Garforth from Garforth Education, and I am honored to have Dr. Tim Odegard join me today to discuss his thoughts about reading. So thank you, Dr. Odegard, for joining me today. Do you want to give listeners a little background about who you are and what you do?
Hi. Yeah, I am a person who has a long history with trying to understand reading. Starting as a child, it was a difficult thing for me to do, all the way up to a research scientist, and then as a reading interventionist, trying to understand how we can intervene and remediate the most struggling readers. So I'm kind of a person who's had a lifelong journey with trying to understand reading and writing and how we can help others with doing that. So thank you for having me, Dr. Garforth.
Well, thank you so much for being here. So I guess the best way to start is, what do you think? Is reading a natural process?
No, 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 no. Oral language is a natural process up to a certain point, but reading is not. We know from neuroscience, case studies, and then more neuropsychological studies in the 60s and 70s, and then non-invasive brain imaging, that we co-opt areas of the brain that are used for object recognition in the left hemisphere to recognize letters. And then we link that into our naming system from oral language, our meaning system, which is actually distributed across the entire cortex and also subcortically. And then our ability to articulate, to map sound to print, to extract and represent meaning. So it has to be taught to us. And it's a relatively new human invention. And those of us in the world who acquired the invention of literacy kind of skyrocketed in our cultural relevancy and what we were able to develop as far as all of the goods and things that we have and the technologies we're able to create. So it's quite a new phenomenon. And it's not something we're innately born to do. And we know that from kind of comparative evolutionary anthropology, psychology, and up to modern day neuroscience, looking at people and how we develop reading. That's my short answer.
Yeah, well, and that's the big misconception that we have. I mean, there's so many famous quotes out there talking about how children children become readers in the laps of their parents. And like you, I struggled with learning how to read, and I have a child that has dyslexia as well. And we were very well read too. I read to my child thousands and thousands of books, and we would sit on the couch for hours reading at a very young age. So it's not that there wasn't the exposure. It's just, it wasn't something that the brain was pre-wired to do. And I think the struggle that we're having, especially in some places around the globe, is shifting from learning to read is a natural process to, well, wait a minute, no, it's not. And there's things that we can do to help it along.
Yeah, so I think that's right. In like the big picture, I'd like to think that we've got more consensus now that we really do have to teach the foundational skills of reading as a point of common ground. I think we should definitely strive to achieve that. That is something that we're going to have to achieve. I also hope that we understand now as we progress and we move past our pre-literate selves developmentally into literate selves, that our oral language development is symbiotic on our reading development. So we actually start to acquire more advanced aspects of even oral communication as we develop background knowledge, more academic vocabulary and different aspects of vocabulary through written language that we're exposed to, as well as more complex ways of putting words together into sentences, phrases, paragraphs, expository text, narratives that we just don't do naturally or commonly, as we've done through kind of naturalistic studies of production of oral language. We just don't do that. So we have to think that we have to be taught how to read, and then also reading and oral language development become symbiotic on one another once we're in school and we're learning the capacity to do that. I think those are some shifts that would be very beneficial for us to take.
Yes, of course. And, the thing that a lot of people don't think about is that formal writing, so we're not talking about text messages or emails, that are sent between friends and family. It's a lot more structured than spoken language.
Correct.
And the only place that an individual is going to get this is through either listening to text being read
Correct.
to them or by reading it themselves. We're not going
Yeah,
to see
that's
in movies because we can observe so much more through our eyes, right? So if you're watching a movie based on a book, you're not having those same wonderful descriptions of the Hogwarts castle. You're seeing one person's perception of it.
Yeah, I think that's right. That the narratives that we see are not going to be as rich and lavish as a written narrative, even when they're turned into it. I've never thought about it in the way that the movie industry will adapt books in that way. So the exposition of a scene would be richer, oftentimes, in written narrative. Now, individual authors, of course, are going to, Joseph Conrad's writing style and Faulkner's writing styles were qualitatively different than Hemingway's. And then we could bring Flannery O'Connor into the mix too, when she had a very different from all three, than those three of those men. And the way that she crafted her narratives was very different. So I do think that that's very true. But when you get into certain narrative authors, just even the text structure of a Faulkner sentence is going to be just really laborious to parse your way through. And as a person who struggled to read, it was very difficult to make my way through, let's say, As I Lay Dying, for example. The only declarative sentence I remember is my mother is a fish. But after that, it was very long and very prosaic writing. And so same with Joseph Conrad. Those are two classic examples of people who wrote, whereas Hemingway is often given as a person who has more of a sparse dialogue. And then there's other authors out there who have different ways of doing it. I just picked any kind of prototypical person or writer that anybody who's had a kind of a Western literature perspective would have bumped into at some point, and they're qualitatively different than one another. In expository text, we actually even use different syntactic structure and ways of putting things together. So, I mean, your point's true of text written to explain and teach, as well as narratives and stories that we use, and we don't capture the same thing in a cinematography of those.
Yeah. So now that I think we've covered the basis that learning to read isn't a natural process and it is something that needs to be taught. Why is it that some students pick it up almost through osmosis and others don't?
I think that comes down to their ability to more rapidly map the sounds and letters together and to kind of understand the structure of the written language that they're the alphabet in an alphabetic language where individual sounds map to letters or clusters of letters, their ability to do that fairly rapidly. And we know that that's an individual difference. So some of us take tens of thousands of repetitions to solidify and codify learning, where others will take less time. And that probably has something to do with their innate wiring in their brain, which isn't pre-wired to read, but is there. So you do have some people who just seem to have a knack for it, that are more just language comes easier to them. They are not the norm. Just like it's not the norm for someone to struggle as profoundly as you and I and our children have, is the norm either. We're on the extreme outliers, but we can learn from ourselves. And then in the middle, there's people who are going to need some semblance of direct instruction to kickstart that. I like to use the analogy of escape velocity. So we know from reading science that what we're trying to do is give people direct instruction, teach them the basics of sound symbol correspondences, allow them enough practice in context and repetition so that just like a rocket trying to escape the gravity, that they have enough to where they can become more automatic and efficient, and it moves out of the deliberate, effortful process that takes a lot of energy and resource to escape from, and then we move on. It's kind of a way of thinking about that self-learning hypothesis that's been proposed by David Scher and others. But I refer to it as escape velocity. And some of us just take a lot more resources and power and lift to escape the velocity of just the deliberate, effortful process that we need. And we definitely have to have those boosters in place to get us to where we need to go to become lifelong, efficient readers.
I love that analogy of the escape velocity, because just knowing, the students that I've worked with over the years and then seeing that shift, right? it takes so long to get them to that point. And then once they hit that breaking point and are able to escape, things start to become easier for them to learn, and not needing the same number of repetitions and direct instruction. So we have that self-teaching happening.
Yeah. And so to follow up on that, we've known, or we've had kind of this way of thinking about the learning systems in the brain for at least since the early 80s, about there's at least these two systems, the fast and the slow system.
Mm-hmm.
The fast being is fast learning, and it's going to be driven out of brain areas in the medial temporal lobe. We make these sparse representations. It's very prone to forgetting, and it needs a lot of explicit instruction to kind of hotwire that to work right. But we can effortfully kind of get our way through it. But the slow learning system takes tons of repetition with feedback about trial and error. And over these thousands of repetition, the more subcortical areas will learn the structure of what you're learning. But they work in parallel with one another, or they work alongside of one another. And the one is going to look like it's coming on board faster. For example, if we were to rote memorize high frequency words, it might look as if we're learning a lot quickly, but we're not necessarily learning the actual structure of how we're putting print and sound together in words that's needed, because that's going to be a much slower. And because the fast system is very prone to forgetting, it would present with some children who are having more difficulty with that, seeming as if they come in and they've slept and now they seem to have forgotten what you taught them the day before. If you're trying to rely on this very laborious, fast memorization process that's based off of kind of this more declarative, explicit learning system, which we would want to also put in place. So that's what the analogy of the escape velocities. We're trying to get enough of that happening to where we've escaped and we've got more of the actual structure implanted more subconsciously in our minds to where we do it. Everybody learns this way, it seems, but just the amount of time it takes even for the fast and the slow systems to run is different. If that made any sense, I could have been completely off base.
No, it does. And as you're discussing this and the analogies that you're using, it makes me think of another way to phrase things for those individuals that are hesitant to see that it's not a natural process. So for infants, learning how to crawl and learning how to walk are natural processes, unless there is a physical disability that's like if they have a spinal bifida or some sort of thing that's stopping that natural process from developing. So through exposure and through exploring their world, they're going to learn how to walk. Now, some learn how to walk at 9 months and others learn how to walk at close to 2. And in those situations, if they're a late walker, especially in urban centers, we're going to start seeing that physical therapy begin for those late walkers. And even though they might say, oh yeah, well, we could wait, and it is going to happen, you still want to make sure that support is there. And that is a natural process. Now, when we come to reading, are there things that we can do to help identify kids early on and say, look, based on their profile, we think they need the support so we can make it so they can succeed with reading?
The answer is yes. Let's circle back again to what you were just saying. So having been trained as a developmental psychologist, I want to put the caveat on that to say that by natural, we mean innate ways that parents automatically respond to infants. For example, we already scaffold and hold them up. There's culturally some cultures which actually place additional scaffolds so that on average, their children walk a little bit faster than, let's say, kids in a different culture or community would. Same thing with talking. Across every language, innately we do baby talk. And it has the same presentation. And it seems to be a way that we're kind of hotwired or hardwired to interact with babies. And there's certain things that we have been evolutionarily kind of evolved to do in response to infants that helps them to be safe, protected, and to have these developmental opportunities. So teaching to read, however, goes well beyond what kind of intuitively or instinctively a parent is going to engage a child in doing. So it isn't as if you just plop a child down in the middle of a bunch of adults talking to one another, they would intuit that. Actually, the way that adults engage with children is a little bit different and is shaping that development. So I did want to just put not a caveat, but more of a qualifier on that, to where it's not as if, and I always say timidly that through neuroscientists at science in the 50s and 60s, we did a lot of studies on animals that we never have to do before. And we do know that without environmental stimulation, the brain simply does not develop. So there are classic studies done with kitty cats and other animals where they're deprived of sensory input and their brains don't have the same they mature and they get bigger, but not the same development. So we know that it's an interaction with the environment. So reading is the same, except for the amount of explicit instruction and thoughtful instruction to co-opt and allow these other areas which were not innately kind of pre-wired to do this, and then not having adults in the world who are innately, instinctively going to engage with the child in a way that allow them to learn, requires us to then come in and actually do what we would call explicit direct instruction. So I think that's the longer answer to your first question about is reading innate versus oral language being innate.
Mm-hmm.
And to your second question, yes, there are things that we can look at. I do think there's an important shift happening, because what we have now uncovered over well over 100 years worth of research is pretty stock profiles of struggling reading profiles. And we know what they look like. And we're also now getting a good glimpse into how we can have a crystal ball in preschool to find out children who are at high risk. So these are our classic profiles of a child who will struggle potentially with the print reading skills. And they're going to have certain issues early on in the phonological modules of language, and also naming and word retrieval are good indicators of those types of issues early, 3 and 4 years of age. Now, we also have the developmental language disability, which is going to be more of a understanding and speech production, not articulation, but the production of sentences and phrases which are grammatically structured in a way that you would think. And the ability also, because we do this before we're even 5, to start to put suffixes on words, to change them and make them plural, or to make them a verb, a different type of verb, for example. Children who are at high risk for developing a developmental language disability, we're going to show different types of indicators in that. Why is that important? Because one actually is clearly called language and is a production and also a receptive issue. So how they understand spoken language, also how they produce it, that is going to turn into a child who struggles with reading comprehension solely, but they might develop capacity if they're directly taught to read words and to spell words. And then this is also the profile that I've always hypothesized, if we looked earlier, we would find that we often call the late emerging, that Hollis Scarborough looked at, Don Compton's looked at. Well, thanks to longitudinal research done by Hugh Katz, Tiffany Hogan, and many others, we now know that those late emerging could be found earlier, as early as 3 and 4 from a risk factor standpoint. Just like we can find kids who by first grade may be struggling to read words and spell words, we can find them as early as 3 and 4 as well, thanks again to the longitudinal work of Hugh Katz and his lab and others, as well as work that Nadine Gobb has been doing out of Harvard recently to then put the brain mechanics behind it and the such. So we actually don't have to wait until a child has the catastrophic failure of reading to spell and struggling to read and spell words to know that they're at high risk, just like we don't have to wait until they can't comprehend written language to know that either. We can use a more preventative, more risk model, just like we do, let's say, in heart disease. And we already know that my child at 12 is at high risk for heart disease. He has a family history for it. He's already got elevated levels of cholesterol, but he does not have heart disease. He's at elevated risk for it, which means that if he doesn't do things right in his lifestyle and we don't watch it, he may have the same fate as his other relatives and die of a heart attack or a stroke. So we can avoid the catastrophic failure potentially by intervening earlier and preventing that. I too am also at high risk of heart disease, but I do not have heart disease. Heart disease would be a profound buildup of plaque in my arterial walls that then puts a load on my heart. My calcium score off my most recent scan is 0, but am I still at high risk? Yes, I am, because of my biometrics and my family history. So that's just the reality. We can prevent the catastrophic endpoint of me having a heart attack or a stroke, just like I'd like to prevent that for my son. And we have the opportunity to alleviate and reduce the potential end state of these struggling reading profiles if we were to identify and intervene early. That's what all the research seems to say. Would it prevent it completely in all cases? I don't think so. And that doesn't seem to be what the data show, but we could alleviate and definitely remove the severe deficits that we might experience later on. So that's, I think, what people like Rick Wagner are proposing. I think that's definitely what Hugh Katz is proposing. I definitely think that's what Yakov Pesher is proposing. I know that's what Nadine is proposing, and that's what I'm proposing. We're all basically proposing the same thing. At the micro level, pocket protector level, we all have variations of what we mean by that. But at the large level, we all acknowledge that dyslexia is real. We all acknowledge that developmental language disability is real, but we could also acknowledge that if we identify risk early, we could start to do behavioral interventions sooner to prevent such catastrophic end states, if that makes any sense as well.
Yes, but I'm in it. So I follow this research that you're citing, and I completely agree. But for the listeners, why is this intervention early on so important?
So I think for a couple of reasons. One that I think is obvious and always talked about, and I think one that's not so obvious and is often under talked about. So the one reason is that we want to support with the proper stimuli to get those brain areas activated. If we do know that these kids are at more severe risk, let's just talk about the dyslexia profile of having to have lots and lots and lots of repetition and lots of explicit instruction, then the sooner we get that repetition, the sooner we get that explicit instruction, the better. And it will prevent them from having such problems. Now, something that is talked about would be the social emotional side of this. As you get into school, as you start to intuit that your sole job there is to learn how to do reading, math, and science, and you can't do reading, then you start to question your ability and your worth because your one job is to learn how to read. So it starts to develop a disengagement or the potential for a lot of internalizing and also externalizing. So internalizing feelings of shame, worthlessness, internalizing of low affect and depression, externalizing destructive behavior, outbursts, not wanting to be there, finding excuses, also psychosomatic, having belly aches and having problems and winding up in the nurse's office too. Third reason is if we don't stop it soon, let's just talk about the English language, it is really complicated. And so one of the challenges that we don't often admit about why it probably is so hard once we get to fourth grade and beyond to actually move and close the gap is because of the complexity of those words and what we're teaching. Teaching letters is actually fairly straightforward, and we can teach all kids how to do that. Teaching simple single syllable vowel patterns in most instances is also really straightforward. It's something that we can do. Once we get to the more complex multisyllabic words, which will start to bring in higher level meaning units, which shift sound pronunciation and also spelling, it's be a real challenge. So if you don't keep them up and you have to go back to a kindergarten level for a fourth grader and they're kind of on advanced linguistic aspects of reading, then it's going to take a lot of time to move them in the right direction. And they're already feeling disengaged because they probably have some internalizing and externalizing psychological issues that are coming along with it. So I would say that those are the three reasons. Get the brain the input it needs from the environment as soon as possible to start those areas developing. What do we know from what limited brain imaging research we have is that this type of stuff will shift the posterior areas that show differences and start to turn them on. It doesn't fully normalize from what we can see, but we haven't had really the important studies that have tracked kids longitudinally published yet that would look to test that hypothesis. That we also need to avoid any kind of psychological things that could then stand as impediments and challenges to children engaging in the hard work that they have to do for themselves. And then third, if we can get the simpler stuff taught, that when we start to deal with the more complex word parts and word structures, then we don't have to go back and remediate all the way to kindergarten and first grade skills, which is often what we see in the more profound kids who have kind of fumbled through ill-structured educational settings.
Right. And I think that the one thing that I also think is important to mention is the missed opportunity for learning and working on those language skills that we spoke about earlier, because not having the same exposure to the amount of text because they're not reading it. And the vocabulary words that just aren't there, and the syntax and the semantics of language, that because they're not doing the same reading as their peers, we see that Matthew effect, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
Yes, that is true. That's a challenge, I would say, because one of the heartbreaking findings that's often cited is just how little actual text reading students do when we go out and observe as research scientists what's happening in classrooms. And so there isn't a lot of scaffolded, structured, high impact reading happening with immediate corrective feedback to keep them in the right way to make sure that they truly are engaged in the text. So it isn't as if the majority of children are potentially getting access to what they need from a reading standpoint. And I think it's an interesting conversation to have about what the role is and how much of this burden should be placed on the community, and let's say libraries and summer reading programs and after school reading programs and families, and what role a school plays in making sure that they think thoughtfully and strategically about their ELA blocks and build in the opportunities for supervised reading opportunities that allow for tracking of some way to have that happen. Because the one thing that I want to point out about all of the understanding of how the repetitions help the brain to learn the structure is every single neural net model that does this requires feedback about right and wrong to be given to the system, which is never discussed. So you don't have these toy models that people have built of word reading, which I call them toy because they're incomplete. I don't think that they're like when I call my brain figures cartoons. They're just cartoons. They're not actual real pictures of the brain. These aren't real neural nets of the 10,000 or a million neurons in a brain that has a population to do. They're just toys. But they always get corrective feedback, and that bot propagates through the system and changes all the weights in the system. So if you don't have scaffolded reading opportunities that are giving you that input some way, then you're missing learning opportunities from what we know about how neural nets build in the models that we have to simulate that.
of course. And I'm happy that you mentioned family in that conversation, because there's two parts that we haven't touched on yet. The first is there is a genetic component to reading disabilities, such as dyslexia. Now, it's not something that you can just say, oh, okay, I'm going to go to get my DNA done and analyzed. It's not one marker. There's several. So it's not like you can go get a DNA test for dyslexia, and there likely never will be. But when there's that familial history, I mean, I see it in my family. I know families that see it, and it's just like, oh yeah, there it is. It's coming. I think there needs to be more attention to that in the districts and within the schools and the community, and with our pediatricians and our general practitioners, acknowledging that, look, this child is at risk. So I need to identify these early warning signs and get the intervention as soon as possible. And then there's also the home environment this child is raised in, because they're not necessarily going to have the same literacy exposure, because a parent who can't read is not going to have the hundreds of children's books in their house and not be able to read them. I'm not sure if you're familiar with John Corcoran and the teacher that couldn't read, but in his book, he talks about I believe it was his wife went to the library to pick up books for his children, and he didn't know the book, and all the other books, he knew the stories well enough, like, the Disney stories well enough that you can kind of fake it through. But this is a new book that he didn't know, he hadn't seen, he hadn't heard. And his children said, well, that's not how mommy read it. And it is parents avoiding that awkward situation, because if they don't like reading, if it has all these negative emotions associated with it, they're not going to necessarily have the support at home to give that environment that the child needs.
Yeah, and that could be true for some instances. However, that's not the sole.
No.
Right. So we don't, I completely agree. It sometimes we have counter narratives where we can now just blame the families too, because they're not reading to them enough because they too can't read. I had a similar experience, but differently. I am clearly able to read and write and have published lots and lots. But my son held his hand up to my mouth and said, no, Daddy, stop reading, because I'm so, even with a children's book, I'm not a fluent reader. And by the time that he was 2.5, he was able to pick up what a fluent reader should sound like, because his brain was geared to understand the prosthetic presentation of oral language. And I should have been able to, as a model reader, read a child's book that way. But he knew that he can't. So he wanted his mommy to read it to him. So it goes beyond just the reading of the words on the page. In your example, it's also just when your 2.5-year-old can identify that there's something different with your presentation and your prosthetic reading of a child's book, then that goes to it, right to the heart of it, right there. But I was still reading with him, and he had books full. He has a room full of books. We read them every single day of his life, and into first grade, the wheels still fell off for him, and he still wasn't able to read and spell anywhere near what he should have been. And then so I got him into intensive reading intervention with spelling components, and also a multi-component with comprehension and language development as well. So even in the best of homes, with parents who have the books, but you're right, an additional complicate would be if it was another person who is kind of functionally illiterate and struggles in that way, in the example you did, then the child may not be getting the same exposure to print in the home. But even in instances in homes with the exposure, we can still see the presentation of dyslexia with a familial link. Since, I have dyslexia, my sister has dyslexia, my son has dyslexia. And that's simply to say we all three profoundly struggled, even with schooling, to learn how to read and spell words in the English language.
I mean, it's the same in my family, but then one of my children is one of those kids that picked it up before kindergarten. And seeing that they had the very same experiences at home and seeing just how different. And I do like the point that you highlighted. It's not the parent's fault, and the amount of exposure to text is not going to change whether the child's going to read or not. It's just recognizing that can play a role, but never say, the child's not reading because they didn't have enough reading at home.
Correct.
We can correct for that in the school system.
Yes. And there is a lot of shame and blame that happens around this, since there is a familial link. And if a person does have this, it's not just limited to reading disabilities. It's true of mental health and others. We don't want to have our children have to have the same struggles that we did. And so I do think a lot of parents ask themselves if this is something that I want to roll the dice on. And then if it does happen, I think they carry shame with them, because I've spoken to a lot of these parents, and then they blame themselves. And then in some family dynamics and family systems, then the non-impaired parent starts to blame both the child and the parent, because as anybody who's tried to work through schooling with a disability or a learning difference, however you choose to label those in your choice of language, it's not an easy task. And it's a hard, rough road. Now, and everybody has strategies, and I've spoken to this a lot. We all have our burdens and on our load to carry. It's just one of the things that happens when you have something happen with a developmental learning difference is it happens pretty early in your life. And so you start to experience those challenges a lot sooner, which, as I've said before, creates the capacity for empathy with others who also carry their own burdens that they either are born into because maybe of their race and color and creed and the cultures they're in, or for other reasons. So I do think it's the potential for us to have empathy and to expand our understanding of how easy life is for everybody.
Now, when it comes down to teaching, what can we do to best set our students up for success? That's pretty open-ended. So
it is. I would like to, can I go back? There was some, since I'm overly verbose, you had made the comment about family history and wanting pediatricians and everybody else. And so I do think that there's also not a there's a contextualization to that. And I used heart disease earlier.
Mhm.
We have the American Heart Association in the US. And my doctor and my child's primary care physician can open up a risk calculator, enter in things that come in from our blood work, and also a simple questionnaire that they ask on the intake. And those questions never change, by the way, unless I adopt some kind of an unhealthy behavior or I adopt a better behavior. But my family history doesn't change unless somebody else offs because of another heart attack in my family, which is always ever present in my life and my family. So we don't necessarily have the public health instruments and tools developed, at least in our country, and I don't know about in your country, but I would say in North America, that allows us to have more constructive conversations with different groups like pediatricians. Because even if you got them to say, sure, I'm more than happy to do that, tell me how to do that. We don't have those. But in the US, we have the American Heart Association, which my primary care physician pops it up every time. I'll be in there in a couple of weeks. He'll put in my metabolites. We'll get all those things going. He'll ask if I'm smoking. Yeah, I'll say, no. Are you drinking? No. Are you doing all these things? No. Okay, cool. And they'll come back with a risk based off of a model, which is all happening in the background. And wouldn't that be a lovely thing for us to have for DLD and for dyslexia? To actually have something from a public health standpoint to build off of the 150 years worth of research that would inform and make it a more constructive, productive conversation, opposed to saying, why aren't they doing more? Well, they're not doing more because they don't have the tools in their profession to do more. Because just saying that it's to look for family risk and then do other things is really insufficient when it comes to how we approach medical science and the translation of that into the medical field.
Definitely.
So that was just, I wanted to put that caveat up there, that we could do a little bit more as about thinking about what policy and investments we can make publicly that would actually help to push this conversation forward in a very productive, constructive way.
Yeah, and obviously there isn't an unlimited amount of funding. And I think a lot of these screeners that are coming about, especially Dr. Nadine Gabb's one, has the potential to really make big impacts in the future for our children that are coming down the line to enter school. They're heading at least in the right direction.
Correct, I would think so. So again, and it's a different mindset also too. So I sometimes have people push back on me about why I would even care about these self-reports, because they increase the diagnostic accuracy if they do in the model, and that's helpful. So if it improves my ability to accurately classify a child as at risk and what their risk level is, that's a benefit. So we know that, for example, having a family history improves the diagnostic accuracy of determining risk for heart disease over and above just the objective measures of my blood pressure, my cholesterol levels, my BMI. Those all go in, those are objective measures. But there's also just things that we can ask on a questionnaire that when we add those in, they tick up the ability to be predictive just a little bit more. So that's kind of where we're at. And you're right, there's a for-profit company, Early Bird, that's working in this direction and could come out with something really, really nice. I would say that if we took a model from public health, that we could also create something that would be a little more uniformly generic based on the same models and know what kind of indicators should go in there. And then behind the scenes, there's a computer algorithm that spits out an odds ratio that a person who's trained to understand what that means could then make a determination.
Yes, of course. Now, can we do a little bit about what you think as far as reading instruction? What can we do from the foundation to make it so you have more students from the start learning how to read?
So to have a thoughtful and intentional way of structuring your English language arts block so that you could, starting day one, have a data-informed decision about what level of intensity kids are going to need in direct instruction in the different skills-based components. And then also making sure that there's an enriched language for academic language development, background knowledge as well. So it really takes teaching them directly letters and sounds, letter formations, and how those all to go together. We know that spelling is beneficial to do that as well. And then also we know that we want to be able to then have them move into being able to pronounce those words, string them together. And in parallel to that, we want to continue to give them an enriched environment to keep developing their oral language skills, their receptive and their expressive, their ability to understand spoken academic language as well as use that generatively. We also want to continue to build up their background knowledge. And I've been using the term kind of academic vocabulary because in the school system, what we do is we bring in more of an academic setting. And that is not to minimize nor marginalize any type of language dialect or kind of other ways or sources of knowledge. I come from a blue collar family that grew up in the Ozarks. And whereas we have subtle differences to our dialectical way of speaking, we have accents, we also have different cultural background sources of knowledge that we value than you would just say are in an academic setting. And we had other ways of speaking about it. So in academic terms, we want to really elevate the academic discourse and the way that we use language overall in the day as well. So it's two parts, the skills for the print skills development and the real focus on continuing to have an elevated development and progression of teaching the academic vocabulary and knowledge that we want the kids to get. And I know that's a glossing kind of thing, but it's hard to go into what that really looks like. And you can ask follow-up questions if you want me to drill down on any of those different pieces.
Well, I think the big takeaway is that we can't leave it to chance. And the best way to make sure that the most students are going to learn how to read is have that explicit structure laid out and not leave it open to interpretation as to when and how to do things. There is a very concrete understanding of the best practices for reading instruction and what skills need to develop in which order in order to produce effective readers.
In broad strokes, yes.
Yeah.
So we know the scope being what types of vocabulary we should be fostering in our children. We know that we want them to develop the background knowledge that they may not just get by living their lives so that they can have academic knowledge so they can progress through schooling and then move on to whatever career path they want to go on to. We also know that there's going to be specific skills when it comes to developing print language, developing their awareness of the spoken structure of the language, the phonological structure, the mapping of that back down to print as well. So the sound symbol correspondences, and then other aspects of the print. So the scope tells us that. The sequence you hit on is we've pretty much dialed in broad stroke terms, kind of what develops and when and what kind of order. Like single syllable words for reading are going to be taught before we get into multisyllabic words, for example. Once we start to introduce and we get some basics around vowels, and how they're represented in letters, then we can start to string and put together some multisyllabic words as well. So there's, in broad strokes, I would say that there is a sane way of sequencing the instruction when it comes to these things. We would start with more general use words for academic vocabulary and then move into fairly good utility words that most of our kids aren't going to know, but would have broad stretch before we then advanced into more disciplinary vocabulary that would only be used in, let's say, biology and not chemistry. And some might be used in geography or geology, but not in history, for example. So there's a progression that we can point to, but often teachers and practitioners want to drill down to such a minutia level about surely there's research on exactly how this should sequence out at real minutia level. And we don't often have the research to suggest what order of what type of vowel pattern should come first in a single syllable word. We kind of uniformly say that closed syllables with short vowel sounds in them are going to be what we'll start off with. They're pretty straightforward and easy to kind of approach. But after we get past there, we normally will have a certain progression of how things go. So that's my only kind of caveat to that is that I often see people kind of get stuck in the weeds about the micro questions, and they kind of, as you've highlighted again and again, kind of the big picture, the big takeaway with the big is you need a scope, that's well justified on research, and you need a defensible sequence that seems to be working for most of your students.
And the appropriate resources to go along with it. I know I'm often asked, what scope and sequence should I use for introducing the grapheme phoneme correspondences? And I say, well, whichever one best suits your resources, because you don't want to be in a situation where you're having to create a whole bunch of different resources and searching from them when you do have an appropriate set of resources that follow a different scope and sequence made available to you.
Correct. And so in our country, in the US, when we were starting to reconfigure our research arm of our Department of Education, and one of my mentors, Dr. Valerie Reyna, was up there leading those efforts, we were trying to use a model from medicine, from psychopharmacology, where there's set things, there's gold standard research that shows that it's effective in this way, in this pattern, in this way of doing it. And so we really wanted a programmatic approach to it, where programs would be in their totality demonstrated to have efficacy for a specific domain. That gave rise to, in the United States, what we have is the What Works Clearinghouse. It hasn't necessarily had the return on an investment that we had hoped to have. And that's a whole different podcast, a whole different conversation. But the spirit of it is still, if you can offload from teachers, which when I talk to teachers, one of the reasons why they often push back on change is that change often comes with additional training, often comes with them feeling compelled or pressured to have to make their own materials, a lot of work on developing lessons that, quite frankly, they're not paid, nor do they have time to do. And that's just being real. So having a set program that will work for the most and the majority of students as it comes out of a box, you can invest the training and supervision and coaching into doing that with high fidelity. So my approach when I work with schools and districts and regions in the states is to say, I would really advise you to find really rigorous, well out of the box ELA programs, and then see how much you have to supplement those after you track your data, after you've got high implementation and fidelity with those, so that you don't have to go in and kind of custom curate bespoke things for the majority of your students. Leave that for your tier, what we call in the States, are more advanced tiers of instructional support, where we might come in and do more customization. We should be coming in and doing more individualization and customization. So that's one approach. And then the advances we've made in some forms of technology have been used to capture students' responses and patterns of behavior so that the machine learning algorithms in the background do what they're really good at doing, which is seeing patterns and then sharing that in actionable things for teachers to do to help differentiate the reading instruction for all those kids within the core down to your single student level. It's hard work. It takes expertise, and it also takes being able to see big patterns. And computers are actually pretty good at doing that. And humans, we don't always do that until we have expertise, which we know takes a long time. Or at least I know one Canadian, Malcolm Gladwell, talks about how it takes a lot of time and repetitions to become experts. So expert teachers are something really prized and cherished, because experts in general are prized and cherished.
Definitely. Now, one thing that I also wanted to address is when we're looking at instruction across the grades, are we wanting to put the same, or make sure that the focus on, say, the 5 pillars: phonological awareness, phonics, vocabulary, reading comprehension, and fluency? Do you want 20% in each of these categories, or should it shift and adjust based on time and the results in the classroom?
So it will shift and adjust just because of how development progresses. And we know this empirically from a longitudinal study, which was a huge investment here in the States, and the acronym is LARC. And so we know that they were able to confirm with a lot more data and a lot more students and a lot more context and a lot different places what we had seen anecdotally in small numbers. I mean, 200 kids for a longitudinal study to try to figure out how all kids of English are kind of progressing is really insufficient one-offs. Science is the collection of lots of confirming evidence from independent labs coalescing, which is why we often use the gold standard now of meta-analysis, which is an analytic approach to look across studies to see where the signal is in the noise to use it. But the large study showed that as we progress, as we become proficient in the foundational skills, as the text and the words become more complicated, as meaning and meaning becomes more and more important, we see a shift in kind of what is predicting language. But of course, the caveat to that is if you don't have the prerequisites built, then you can't do that advanced works to begin with. So again, developmental language disability or disorder will manifest and turn into a written issue of comprehension if unaddressed. And then a risk for a print level, I don't spell or read very well, will manifest even earlier. Now, why don't we see in writing the DLD as much? Is because we know from the Lark study and others that there's a lot more dependent on being able to read the words on the page, and it has a big weight. And the reading comprehension questions aren't all that hard to answer to begin with. But it's when we get to the advanced grades that they actually becomes a lot more important to have the vocabulary, the background knowledge, the text structures to answer the questions, because the reading comprehension questions are getting a lot more complicated. So it's not going to be as straightforward and easy. They're not as easy questions. So we're actually tapping into those, which is meaning that there's people diligently working on how to close that gap and to identify those comprehension-based problems even earlier. But we could even do that back in preschool to some extent to find the risk of that. So no, it wouldn't be. And PA is a great example of that. You really don't want to be spending as much time working on a sound-only type of an approach. And if it is being used, it's going to be used in the service of reading and connected into the letters and the spelling patterns that we want them. So let's say, for example, it's not uncommon and well thought out, empirically validated dyslexia programs to have PA in the advanced work just be a setup for spelling, for example. And what do we know from Colby Hall's recent meta-analysis? We know that spelling for individuals with dyslexia being directly taught has a large and significant effect size on their outcomes from intervention. We knew that from two meta-analyses that have been done previously as well, but the most recent one was looking specifically at children with dyslexia and what seemed to be components of intervention that were effective. And it's been a working hypothesis, and we've had evidence for it for a while, but it's nice to see that confirmed with a meta-analysis to show us what's happening. So it really is that you shift what you're looking at and the complexity of what you're looking at and the bulk of what you would be doing as far as direct instruction would advance.
Wonderful, thank you. Now, as we're wrapping up, do you have any final thoughts about reading that you think we've missed?
Probably, but final takeaway thoughts. I think the one thing that we often miss, that I hear teachers missing, and sometimes parents, is I think they underestimate the fact that it is truly exceptional to be illiterate. And there's no justification for more than a handful of children in a society where literacy is prevalent to be illiterate and to be functional illiterate. So there really is no reason why a person should get to adulthood without the capacity, because every child will be able to learn the gift of literacy if they're given the instruction that they need. And the instruction isn't overly complicated it's not like it's different, special. It doesn't require you to do special exercises in calisthenics. It doesn't require you to go get biofeedback from an EEG system. It's something that we could do with sticks and sand not for multisensory, just take that away. But I could use a beach with a stick and things to teach how we know how to teach children how to read, spell, and write. So it's nice that we have technology. It's nice that we have all these additional things, but it's pretty straightforward, and we know how to go about teaching the vast majority of children. And I started off my reading research looking at what we call the persistently poor responders. And why I called it them that opposed to non-responders was Patricia Mathis rightly corrected me the one time before the first paper was published, and I used the term non-responders, to which she says, no, they're all responding. They may just not be responding at the rate that you think is sufficient. If we look at if they're learning what we're teaching, and if they're learning the sub skills, if they're learning how to read words, if they're learning how to spell words, they are, but the pace of learning is different. for even the most protracted children. So they still are learning. And so I think the takeaway is that sometimes we, in our modern educational systems and the way that we screen and we progress monitor, we discount the work of the children being supported by interventionists in the classrooms with them, because they are actually learning, but the pace may not be the way that we want it. And until we try something different as far as intensification of that instruction, we've not demonstrated that we can move it faster, but we can also demonstrate that they are learning what we're teaching them. And we often don't think about the first question, which is, are they learning what I'm teaching them? The second question, is that transferring to more general outcome measures, which I'm often seeing people use as the progress monitoring tools and instruments in public education here in the United States. But there's two questions. Are they learning what I'm teaching? Are they making gains there? And is that transferring over? And that comes directly from a recent JLD publication where we showed that in response to intervention, they learned all the print skills and concepts and could read a whole lot better, and they could spell a whole lot better, but they weren't transferring that to the grade level expectations in 4th or 5th grade for the really big chunky words on the norm reference tests. And those are two different outcomes. But some of the kids actually were able to then jump and make that leap, but some still needed all the direct instruction and repetitions to keep moving forward. So my big takeaway that we didn't cover is, it's been my observation from reading the research that vast majorities of kids, the majority of them, can learn how to read, and we often discount the learning that happens in response to intervention.
Yeah. And persistence is key with these guys. And we shouldn't let them fall through the cracks. And they deserve the right to read.
Yeah, of course.
The takeaway, I think.
Yeah. So why do they deserve the right to read? Because it's human right, but it's also something that we're all capable of learning to do with proper instruction at the proper intensity and dosage for us.
Exactly. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining me today, Dr. Odegard. I've really enjoyed our conversation.
Yeah, thank you for having me.